to ensuring successful trial logistics in Africa, and what specific roles they play in the process?
So I think we've already had some very healthy discussion this morning, and Kenneth highlighted a lot of valid points in terms of the roles in service provision. I think for me, the challenge to everyone in the room is, as key clinical trial stakeholders, I think we have a responsibility to all of our sponsors to make sure that in terms of service provision, we are actually performing correct vendor management, and that forms part of the due diligence that we need to perform to ensure that we are actually selecting the correct vendors. Vendor management is very, very key. We haven't spoken a lot about it over the last 2 days, but due diligence is certainly important. We need to look at areas of accreditation, ISO standards. We've spoken a little bit about GCP, GCLP guidelines, the need for documentation and SOPs. Specifically, just to zone in on logistics, I think it's very, very key that we have life science specialists in logistics roles. That's definitely been a gap in the logistics area. And I think just to highlight that if a particular service provider dominates in a country, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the best at what they do. It just means that they're the only service provider there. So feel free to perform audits on your service providers, perform vendor management in terms of service provision, ask key questions about standard operating procedures, about training, about what are the roles and responsibilities of your service providers that are key and vital in performing that supply chain responsibility for our clinical trials. That's paramount to ensuring the success and the conduct of our clinical trials. And without that, in as much as we can do all of the background work from patient recruitment, participant centricity like we've spoken about this morning, but without robust supply chain management plans and good vendor oversight, standard SOPs, we're doing our clinical trials an injustice by not making sure that we're attending to some of those key areas.
Thank you. Mr. Rioni?
I think she's given it a pretty good overview and highlights here, but I would say that sample management is critical. It is one area that is met with challenges that are beyond the site. Some are pretty much how that is organized outside the site that you might have less control of, but if you have a better overview of what is expected, then you can track those and ensure that it is going on smoothly, which is not easy when you don't understand, one, what are the customs requirements in each and every respective country, because this again varies per territory, and what are the airline requirements that are needed in that regard, and what are the frequency and the schedules of such airlines so that you can properly move out shipments safely. And you must understand that whenever you're going to do that, at that stage, then you need to know locally what are the consumable supplies that are available. And if they are limited by any scope, then you need to have planned that in advance of your clinical trial. And you know that some of these consumables are things that are sourced through third party, in-country or out-country. And you need to know the other is availability of things that you might need to, like, are there liquid nitrogen plants, and how many are they? And if you're also going to need to use dry ice as one of the major shipment item that you use, then you need to be aware that I can source this locally at the end of the day. So those are really critical. And if there are shipments that you have to do that is specialized, like shipping a pathogenic sample, the level of Ebola or Lassa, then come in and collect that sample on behalf of the person who is shipping, and then it's delivered. So yeah, budgeting is also a factor here. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think also that when we talk about shipment, it's not only about samples, we talk also about IP shipment, so importation and exportation. And in both cases, we need also to have a good learning about local customs. And yeah, go.
I think just to add on the customs piece, one of the developments that is now currently underway, and this is across Africa, is the development of a framework structure that looks at the customs regulations in each country across Africa, including South Africa. And as it's been highlighted already, where is dry ice available locally? I think dry ice in Africa has been a challenge in certain regions. It's not impossible to get dry ice, but there are some areas where it's more expensive to manufacture, and the costs that drive that need to be definitely budgeted for upfront. I think that's where your logistics service provider needs to be able to support in terms of the logistics side, the budgeting, what is it going to cost to be able to supply validated packaging, the validation on packaging, how long will that packaging last, is it the best solution for that particular shipment? I think we've come a long way in terms of packaging validation. There's a lot of nifty packaging solutions that are now available. They are relatively cheaply provided as well, and they are validated to maintain cold chain for up to 10 or 12 days. Specifically with regards to customs control, if shipments need to be topped up, you need to be able to have provision in country where if a shipment is stuck in customs, there are capabilities to be able to do that. And I think in order to do that, you need to have well-trained and well-grounded couriers on the ground to be able to understand the commodity that they're actually handling to provide that service. That's where some of the gaps still sit, and that's where the training and the infrastructure become super important to ensuring that the couriers understand what they're handling. If there's a spillage with regards to the safety, that also needs to be well maintained and managed so that they are also equipped to be able to handle a spill should it occur when we're handling some of the biologicals that we classify as infectious or non-infectious.
Thank you. So I think that the recommendation, global recommendation, is to pull everyone together, all stakeholders, investigators, ethics committee, regulatory bodies, CROs, and to discuss and to provide the best solution for logistical issues to the sponsor in order that the sponsor plan the budget and the timelines, right? So let's go to next question. Do you have something to add about the subject?
No. Please go ahead.
That's clear. So we still don't have with us Mr. Kami, Mrs. Kami? No? Okay. So let's go to next question. What are typical challenges, logistical challenges encountering when conducting clinical trials in Africa, and what measures has been taken to mitigate these challenges?
Well, that's a hard one. I won't say I'm able to speak for each and every respective country, but the challenges that are there with shipments are actually regulatory in perspective, and some goes back to administrations or administrative level of those, because when you're going through the clerical work to approve a permit, that is purely administrative, and all that is made difficult when you lodge your permit request while your shipment has already arrived. So you're bound to have failures or challenges overcoming that. If you are going to ship an IP across Africa, then you might just need to be working closely with both the custom administrations at that level, and be able to understand the regulatory aspects of the same. And they all must be working. You might find all those are, I would say, pretty much departments that don't communicate with one another. So you might have understood that I'll be going to this separately and communicating with them in advance of that time. And express the urgency. You don't just follow up, go and not wait for a response. You might need to push to get that done faster.
I think certainly key points there. I think one of the take-home messages there would be to ensure that the MOHs are involved through the clinical trial application process. So before your IP even reaches in country, you've already got the pre-clearance. One of the approaches that can be done to improve this and to mitigate this is called a wheels-up approach, which means before the shipment even arrives in country, the pre-clearance is already provided, and so you mitigate any delays at customs. Another example is to be able to use the correct validated packaging, so cold chain can be maintained even if there is a minimal delay. I think it's very important to have the buy-in up front when it comes to clearance so that you don't have in customs country delays.
So as it was discussed yesterday with the representative from Kenya, PPB, it's about pre-submission meetings in order to better understand the study and to better understand the logistical studies in order to plan everything. And so we have these challenges, but I think also that we can also add to these logistical challenges all patient recruitment aspect regarding our facilities, transportation, bringing the patient to the hospital or the site investigation. There is this part, and also the language and culture barrier. Do you have something to add about patient recruitment and cultural barrier?
Patient recruitment is a factor because you might need to, you brought in an IP, and that has to be insight in advance of your recruitment processes. And how quickly can you recruit? And there are also recruitment challenges that would have make the study stay longer, and the IP probably either expires. Then you need to follow on what are the proper procedures to dispose or destroy such, and you have to be in constant communication and be tracking that as well. But if you're actively recruiting, then the problem is you might also if you don't plan, then you might run out of your IP as well. And before you ship and bring it on country, you might face a stop, or you hold the study briefly before that arrives. So end-to-end planning and envisioning what the process looks like is very important. So strategic administrative planning on that will be key to the success of such around recruitment.
Thank you.
I think maybe also just to add to that, there's a key role for community advisory boards to play in this part of the actual clinical trial. In South Africa, we have the Treatment Action Campaign, and they've been really great at creating advocacy around certain clinical products and certain disease types. So before there are even clinical trials on the market for patient recruitment to occur, there's already a hype in the communities about the actual disease, about the drugs that are going to be put in place via clinical trial. So I think there's certainly a role in country, in Africa for that. And we need to have more advocacy, I think, around some of these clinical products that are being provided to clinical patients through clinical trials.
Dr. Swad, I think Ms. Kemi Williams has joined us virtually. Maybe she can also give her remarks.
Okay. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can. And sorry that I'm late. I think I got the time mixed up.
No worries. So we'll start with the first question. So what are the typical logistical challenges encountered when conducting clinical trials in Africa, and what measures can be taken to mitigate these challenges?
Okay, so I'll go over a few. I'll hope that I'm not repeating something that has already been said since I missed the earlier discussions. But if you just look at the different phases of clinical trials, right, the study initiation, study conduct, study closeout, you can find the different logistical challenges that we're facing in this region. And then hopefully there are ways we can mitigate them. So let me just start with study initiation. You know, it may have been mentioned earlier on, the contract and regulatory approval process when you're trying to start a study can be very nebulous. And that creates a logistical challenge. So let me pick contracts, for example, when you're working with sites to align on how much you want to pay for the study. Just a minute. Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, sorry about that. So I was talking about when developing contract with sites to align on how much you want to pay. You know, we don't have what you call fair market value calculators in Africa. So you go to Ghana, you may not get one rate for the same procedure. You go to Nigeria, you get a different rate, go to South Africa. And then those rates also, there's really no way for you to clearly validate them because you can go to 3 hospitals and you can get different rates. Now, this is an area that has already been addressed in other parts of the world so that when you're trying to even do your study budgets, you can refer to all these fair market value calculators and determine what the cost might be for the site. And so this is one key logistical constraints that we face. I hope that there's a way we can continue to start looking at how do we work across countries and hospital systems and healthcare systems to start attributing standard cost to standard work processes or procedures that happen that you would need to pay for in a study. Another area, regulatory, I'm sure you guys talked about it earlier this morning, but most times the regulatory processes and timeline that you find on the website usually does not match very well with what happens in real life. And so you might tell someone, a sponsor, that it's going to take maybe 6 months to get regulatory approval. But then when you start to go through the process and you start to have conversations with the regulatory authorities, then you start finding out all the nuanced steps that were not called out in what is provided publicly. And that in itself also creates a logistical challenge when you're trying to figure out how long it would take me from engaging a site and submitting my documents for approval to initiating the study. I would talk just about those two. Later on, when we start to talk around, after we continue the conversation, I may want to touch on trial insurance too, as an area where we also need to look for ways to mitigate those issues.
Thank you. So next question would be, who are the key contributors to ensuring successful trial logistics in Africa, and what specific roles they would play in this process?
I'm sorry, do you mind repeating that question?
Yes, I said, who are the key contributors to ensuring successful trial logistics in Africa, and what specific roles that they can play?
Oh, okay. Well, there are multiple stakeholders, to be fair. And I think that's one thing we need to start realizing, that there is actually a role for most people and for most entities. So we know we've talked about the site, but now let's talk about the investigators, the study coordinators. Those are important stakeholders. What level of training do they have? What level of expertise do they have? And how are we helping them to be able to do their work effectively for the trials? But you know what? The patients are key stakeholders too. Very, very important, right? If you're not able to enroll the patients, if they don't have the right level of information to understand what their commitment should be, or right level of information to understand that this is just a trial. It may not actually do what you think it would do, right? Because we're still trying to investigate a product. Then it may affect how they interact or behave on the trial. And that's why sometimes it leads to retention issues. So that's another key stakeholders. Regulatory agencies, we already know, we need their approval to be able to get through. IRBs are very important. And in fact, I have a lot of respect for IRBs in African countries, because they're doing a lot of work of just making sure that patient safety is really taken care of by the sponsors. But I also think the community, we talked about this yesterday, how well are we engaging the communities? We still have in Africa where people are still a bit suspicious of the trial process, and how much information are we sharing with the communities to educate them about what the trial is about, the benefits and the risk, and the opportunities as well. And so I've mentioned just, a few stakeholders. I believe there are more. For me, supply chain people become very, very important stakeholders, right? If I cannot ship products well within the shipping requirements for the particular study, it opens up a lot of risks to the study. So you will now start thinking about, who are you using for shipment, and cold chain will become very critical stakeholders as well to ensure trial success. So just naming a few off the top of my head on the stakeholders that I would consider important, and I would start to engage as quickly as possible starting a trial in Africa.
Thank you. So I think also that the CRO roles is very important. It's the most important role, as they need to have a deep knowledge of what's happening, the process of the country. He's collecting information from IRB, AR, investigators, sites, and they have the important role to communicate with the sponsor, because I don't know if it's today or yesterday, we said the sponsor doesn't know until he knows. but he needs to know from the beginning what will be happen in order to anticipate the risk management plan. So I'm more focusing about CROs, but for me they are the key players. So if there are any question in the audience?
Good afternoon. Good afternoon once again. I have a couple of questions for the panel. So the first question is, how hard or easy is it to standardize the custom requirements across Africa? What opportunities are there to leverage on technology in terms of standardizing the customs requirements in Africa? And the second question is it possible to be given preference or priority in terms of certain study trial materials, for instance, the human infection trials? So is it possible actually to have priorities so that to prevent deviations or violations in a study? Thank you.
So just to be consistent, the first question was, can we have standard customs process for all African countries, right?
Yeah, and how easy is it to leverage on technology?
How is easy to?
The opportunities to leverage technology in terms of having everything on board in terms of custom requirements.
Okay, so involve technology in customs requirement, right? Okay.
And the second question? Did you get the second question?
Yeah, this is second question.
Oh yeah, so the second question was, is it possible to have a preference or priority in certain study trial materials? For instance, the materials required for human infection trials.
Okay.
Yeah, so that, is it possible to avoid delays to prevent deviations or violations occurring in a particular trial? Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Hello, this is Benson Senga from Cambridge. I'm not sure whether this is going to be discussed elsewhere, but I thought that it's probably a part of the discussion or that is going on. One of the things that I've found a little bit challenging, especially for investigator-initiated trials, is the issue of insurance for participants. And it cuts across quite a number of trials. The problem is that not insurance companies don't have a standard. And you find that sometimes something that you would actually say very minimal risk and which you don't even expect to have any problem, especially related to the trial itself, it's still quite so expensive. How do you try to negotiate? Because the insurance covers are actually renewed yearly, and some of the premiums that are paid are quite expensive for participants and for sustainability, because I know that in our field, not all research are actually sponsored. Some of them may be just investigator originating from the investigator. So please, I don't know if this is something, of course, for sustainability, some of these may be important. Thank you.
There is a question here.
Thanks very much. I think mine is more a comment, follow-up from the gentleman who just spoke. So I think when you're dealing with clinical trials that are funded, in research sites or an academic setting, it's a lot easier to control or ensure that the insurance aspect is covered. And so this is built in largely into grants. and the financing is a requirement for you to be able to ensure that if something does happen to a patient in the clinical trial, this can be covered. And I think with CROs, I mean, a lot of what is being discussed is about, can we standardize this? This should be something that is built in. It should not necessarily have to be the CRO that has to carry the burden of the insurance. It should be the sponsor. Whose clinical trial are you doing? They should be the ones to pay the insurance, and they should be the ones to ensure that if anything happens to one of the participants you recruit, that they are responsible for the care, whether it is short-term or long-term care. So I think it does sort of come into how do we come together and agree and say that this is how we'll proceed. Industry will some people sort of cutting corners and not doing it. Then of course, you know, people will also try and, you know, lower their costs, etc. So it's really important for people to actually come together, have these discussions, but then from here, take it forward and actually say, how do we work better together? How do we standardize and actually institutionalize and say, this is the approach we want to take, and ensure that for all CROs who are working and conducting clinical trials, the same level of protection can be provided for participants. Thanks.
Thank you.
I would like to, is it okay if I add on to that comment? Thank you so much. I really agree with what the lady said. Typically, right, ethics and GCP requirements actually require the sponsors to make sure that they provide insurance for participants on their trials. And my experience shows that most of them would gladly offer. Of course, if you're dealing with, you know, sponsored trials, and if you're doing investigator-initiated trials, it might be a different case, which I completely recognize the question that the gentleman asked. But for most trials that are sponsored by big biopharma biotech, they would provide insurance. Well, the conundrum, though, is that we've also realized that many of these insurance brokers are not really familiar with trial insurances. They do not know how to custom. There's a lot of bureaucracy that goes into the workflow. They compare the insurance that you would obtain for a trial, just like you would, you know, an HMO insurance that you get through your employer for work. And so this is where the gap is. So you go to one country, you might be able to find insurance brokers that know what they're doing. You go to another country, you're just actually helping them to craft what the insurance terms would be because they've never done this before. And I go into that point of standardization or guidelines or guidance. I think there is also an opportunity here for us to have more guidelines on how trial insurance should be managed in African countries. What are the specific, what should the cost be? So that then when you go to the marketplace, you're really just buying and of course submitting that for to the sponsor for payment.